Hello, Daz Studio enthusiasts. This is Not From This World, and I want to welcome you back to another tutorial. Now, I've had several requests for a tutorial on this, so today I want to talk about an add-on to Daz Studio called RenderQ. And RenderQ is designed by a vendor on Daz Studio called ManFriday. This is also the same vendor that created our mesh grabber that I gave a review and tutorial about a little while ago. Now, if you go to the Daz Studio store, you're going to actually find two ManFriday's render queues. The first one is just called RenderQ, and I purchased this a while back, downloaded it, used it for a little while, and then it quickly became obsolete when they came out with second one. He actually calls it RenderQ 3. I never had a RenderQ 2, but RenderQ 3 is what I want to review today. And if I were you, I wouldn't even bother with the RenderQ 1. RenderQ 3 is by far above and beyond what the original RenderQ was. Now, what RenderQ does is it allows you to set up a queue of renders where you can set them up and then walk away from your computer, and your computer will render a series of pictures. Now, this is vital if you are a content creator making a series of pictures such as a comic. Now, I am a comic creator. I make comics, and so I use RenderQ almost every day. It is really a huge asset to speeding up creation and allowing me to render when I'm not even home. So it is a little pricey. It's $40 off of Daz Studio. But I think if you are going to be making a series of pictures, this is really one of the things that you want to have in your Daz Studio library. This add-on can save you so much time and allow you to create so many more pictures and updates than you could if you were not using it. So I highly recommend it. I often say that I don't really want to advertise or be a critic of products, but I might make an exception with this one because it is so useful. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up Daz Studio, and I have a simple scene here. It's kind of adapted from one of the other tutorials I made with Milica. Remember, if you've seen my other tutorials, we talked about how to make her skin look dirty. So she's at the beach, she's been rolling around in the sand, she's a little bit dirty. But what I want to show you with this scene is how to use RenderQ. Now, I have downloaded RenderQ, and just follow the download instructions when you purchase it off of Daz Studio. You're going to download it into your Daz Studio, and you're going to find it under Windows, go to Panes, and then down in the tools, you're going to come down to RenderQ right here and just open it up. And you're going to get this box, and we can kind of expand this a little bit so we can read it better. And what we're going to see is kind of the setup where we can create our queue to be rendered. So the first thing is it says output directory. So I have my renders set up to be stored and put into a bulk render folder that I have created on my OneDrive. And so you're going to add where you want your output directory. So I want it in this bulk renders folder. And then it's going to create a queue, which is a .json file. And this is also something you can select, and I have selected this bulk renders folder. And so it's going to ask you for those, and you can change them if you so desire. You can create where you want your output renders to go, and then you're going to create a queue batch that is also going to be saved. And this kind of does it automatically. And you can choose where you're going to go. Now, the next section is going to say scenes in queue. This is where you're going to select what scenes you want rendered. And honestly, you can make a huge list as long as you want. So I have this scene open with Milica in the beach. So if I want to add that to my queue, I can hit add current. Now, when I hit add current, it's going to put it into the queue list, but then it's going to open up another tab where we can choose some different options. Now, what I usually do when I'm creating a scene for my comics is I want the full scene rendered, so I just leave that fully render scene checked. But what's really cool is you can also check render an icon, and it will actually render a little icon picture if you need to add an icon to something that you're creating to sell, or if you want to save an asset or something like that. You're going to choose an icon so you can render that. You can also render a tip for source scene. And I have to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what a render tip is, but it's an abbreviated picture from your render. If you create an animation, which I don't really make animations at this time, I've kind of played around with it, but there is a box where you can select an animation to render, and it should render that entire animation as well. You also can choose what cameras you want rendered. And this is super cool because you can render one camera or you can render multiple cameras. Now let me show you. I'm just going to X out of this really quick. I have 3 cameras in this scene, and Render Queue will render all 3 if I so desire. So just to show you, I have this first camera, which is kind of a full body shot of Milica. I have camera 1, which is kind of a distance picture of her, and so you can see the water and stuff at the beach. And then camera number 2 is a close-up of Milica. So with the render queue, what's very nice is I can render all 3 of these pictures. And I do this a lot when I'm making a comic. So, like maybe she's doing something. You can have different camera angles to depict a different scene. So when I add the current scene, it's going to ask me if I want just the camera that's saved with the scene, specific cameras, so I can select specific cameras and then I can click on the ones I want to render. So maybe I don't want number 2 to actually render, I just don't check it, or I can just hit all visible cameras. Now once I do that, I'm going to skip over this override render size and pre-render assets. These are more advanced features, and we don't necessarily need to use them in most cases. So I'm going to come down here to target files, and I can choose where my renders are going to be saved to, and the name, it says target render file name, just Kate at the beach, and it'll save that as Kate at the beach camera 1 and camera 2. And then I can save the pictures as a JPEG, a PNG, a TIF, or a BMP. So my work, I usually just use a JPEG. So when I create my comics, they are saved as JPEGs, mostly because they just save a lot of space. You know, I like PNGs, but they eat up a lot of space, right? So they're pretty heavy duty files. All right. And so I'm going to set up where I want my renders to go, what their name is going to be, and then what type of file they are. All right. Now, once I have this set up, all right, I'm going to hit OK. And it's going to go back to my queue. Now I can also take and I can add other scenes in. So I can come up here, hit add, and I can go to some different scenes. And for example, Milika, I can add my scene with Milika when I talked about D-Force. So I just double click on that and it adds it to my queue, and then it gives me this same screen where I can choose what I want to do. So maybe in this case, I'm going to hit fully render the scene. I can come in here. This one looks like it only has one camera. So I'll just hit all visible cameras. This is the folder it'll be saved to. This is the name. And then I just hit OK. So I can make a series of pictures, or I can make a series of scenes that I want to render. Now, once I have that, if I need to go back and change anything, just click on that scene queue, right click, go to edit scene options, and I get my screen right back up so I can change things. So for example, perhaps I just want to have camera 1 and 2. All right, then I hit OK. And I can update that. Now, when I'm all ready, let's say I have, all of my scenes queued. If I want to change their order, I can do that by coming down here and hitting the arrow, and it'll move what order we want things to be rendered first. And then if I want to delete something, I just hit this X. So if I'm like, oh, I don't want to do Milika D-Force, I can just X and it disappears. All right. And so once I have everything ready to render, I'm going to hit render. And then in this case, I haven't saved my scene, so it's going to warn that I haven't saved my scene. So it's always good to save, especially when you're about to render, because if something fails and you didn't save, you may have just screwed yourself over. So I can go back and I can just save this. What's nice is you can have the render queue open and still work on stuff. So see, I can move this around and I can move my camera. I can shrink this down, and I can still work with the Daz Studio even when my render queue is open. All right. And then I just want to hit save again, and it just resaves it. So once I'm ready, I'm going to hit render again, and then it's going to say, this will start the render queue for one scene. Are you sure you want to continue? All right. And so you can tell render queue to reload your currently open scene. So what it'll do is it'll just shut it down and then reload it. If you have a long series of scenes you want to render, you can tell your computer to shut down after the last render. So this is really cool. What I often do is I'll set up my scenes in my render queue, and I will start them before I go to bed, and the computer will just render all of my pictures with all of my scenes all night long. I can get up in the morning, check it. If it's working, it's still rendering, I can go to work. I can be gone all day. I can come back, and once this render queue is finished, If I check this box, it'll just shut down my computer once the renders are finished. Otherwise, it'll just sit there and, your computer will go to sleep, which is fine as well. But you can choose those options and then you hit start rendering. When it goes to start rendering, one of the things you're going to notice is it's going to show you this next screen that is going to show you what cameras are being rendered. So right now it's rendering the scene with just the first camera, and it'll give you an update. It'll tell you this total progress. Down here it tells you how fast this is rendering. So you can see this is going really fast. It's already at 81%. And so you can see the render. So you just let it run and it's going to render this first camera. And this is going so fast we can actually demonstrate what render queue does once it has a picture finished. What's also really nice is you can take this and just click on your picture and you can see your picture as it's rendering. And I can go here and I can click on other things and look at how it's rendering. See, it's at 96%. It's rendering that first picture. And so I can kind of play around with it and see how my render is going. I can move my render to the side. So you can see it's taken 2 minutes to render 97%. What's also really cool is if I need to, I can jump to this screen. And 97% my picture looks really good. If I'm sitting here at the computer and I'm satisfied, all I have to do is hit cancel. And then it's going to move to the second picture. So see, now it's moved to the second picture and it's going to render up the second picture. So now this is the distance picture that I set up, that camera that's a little further away. So now this is rendering. You can see it's rendering really fast. This is a pretty simple scene and I have a decent computer. But if your computer's a little slower, just let it run. The render queue is now finished and it'll come up with this green screen that says done. The whole queue has been processed. So if you didn't select that your computer needs to be shut down, when you come back after your render queue is finished, you will see this screen. You just hit close and then you will notice that I'm going to have both of my pictures. If I open up my folder, you'll see I have both my pictures now rendered. Now you may have noticed that it rendered what I had visible on the screen. So if we don't like this, you can render, like I never render with my tool tabs open. I always open up my tool tabs before I render. Now you see this one, I've got to change a little bit so that I'm showing the background, but I can play with it, come back to the render queue. So I'll go to Window, Panes, go to Render Queue, open this up again, and this is what I just rendered. Let's say I goofed and I want to re-render this. All right, so I'm gonna open this up again. Now this render queue is finished, so I can right click and just say remove scene. Then I can add in a new render queue. So in this case, I'm just going to add the current, but I want that other camera to render as well. So I'm going to hit all visible cameras now, hit OK, and now this is ready to go. Let's add another scene. So I'm going to come down here to Milica, some of her my Milica files. And let's open up the bathtub. All right, this is from another tutorial that I created. We're going to hit create all visible cameras. And then I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm going to hit render again. And again, see, I didn't save it, so I can go back and just save this current render. And then hit start rendering. Now, if you notice, something that I didn't have before was now it's rendering the entire screen, because that's what I have showing on my Daz Studio. So now it's going to render the entire screen. Maybe I don't need to do that and I can render partial screens, but I always render the whole screen. So let's go through the render queue. All right, so I'm going to kind of get this set up so you can see it, and then let's put our picture in there so you can kind of see what's going on, and we're going to just let it run for a few minutes so you can see how this works. Okay, so see, it's rendered that first picture. Now it's going to my second picture. This one might take a few more minutes because it's more close up and you can see more detail with Milica's texture. So let's just let this one run, and then you'll see it change to the third picture. And then what's going to be interesting is I want to show you what it does when it goes to that new scene, because we don't have the Milica bathtub image. We don't have that scene open. So it's going to shut down the Kate at the beach scene, and then it's going to open up the Milica bathtub scene. So we're going to be able to witness this occurring. This original camera is rendering pretty fast. I'm impressed. Some of my comics, the renders take a long time. You know, if I have 4 or 5 characters in a scene, I can set up this render queue and just let it work, and it will render out, you know, in a couple hours. But if I'm asleep, by the time I wake up, I've got my entire scene rendered. So now you can see it's rendered that second. It just opens up the next camera and starts rendering. This is so cool. So now I've got my third picture rendering, which is a close-up of Milica. Okay, it's almost ready. It's at 96%. So instead of waiting, you know, it's taken, I'm so impatient, I can't wait any longer, but it's been rendering for about 4 minutes. So I'm just going to hit cancel, and I want to show you what it's going to do. It's going to open up the next scene. So the next scene is the Milica bathtub. So what's really cool about render queue is it's going to close down the Kate at the beach scene, and you can hear my computer slowing down. The fan just turned off, and it's going to open up the Milica bathtub. And it has a scene countdown where it says scene will be loaded in 27 seconds. Now, if you're not around, it's going to just count this down. But if you're sitting here, you can hit skip countdown. And what this is going to do is it's just going to open up our Milica bathtub scene and then just start rendering whatever cameras I selected. What's really cool about this Render Queue 3, this updated version, is it will bypass any errors that the scene has. So I don't know about you, but one of the things that I get sometimes when I open up my scene is it'll say that the Genesis 8 Essential Pack needs to be installed again. And I don't know why it's doing that. If you know, let me know what's going on in the comments. But I will often get, you can see it says missing files. And so it just bypasses that and it goes right to the render. And so if you look at this, we have a bunch of cameras set up for the Milica bathtub scene. And if I let it, it's going to render all of these cameras. So you have to make sure that you have cameras selected that you actually want rendered. And I just kind of chose this scene randomly. I was showing you decals with this scene. And so this scene has decals where I added the decals to her leg to make her leg look bubbly and soapy. You might remember that render. And for some reason, this render has a ton of cameras. But you can see it's just now rendering this next picture. and it will go through all of the cameras and render everything. But if you noticed there, it bypassed an error. And I will be willing to bet you that that error was where it said that for some reason the Daz Genesis 8 Essential Pack needed to be installed. And I don't know why it does that, but RenderQ is smart enough to know to just ignore it. Now, if you've got a problem with your scene, like a texture issue, RenderQ is going to ignore it, but you're going to see the mistake as it renders. So, if you've got some kind of wacko texture problem, RenderQ is going to bypass it and render the scene, but you may notice that there is a problem with the scene. But, a lot of times we get these little simple errors. It might say that it doesn't have a background or something like that. RenderQ will just bypass it and then keep rendering. If I want to stop the queue, I just hit the X and I start getting out of stuff. See, this camera was in a whack position. So I can just cancel everything, get out of it, get out of my queue, and it will stop. And then I can readjust things, so I can just start working in Daz again, go back to my main camera. And so this is my main camera, and then I can keep working on my scene. So see, here's that second camera. I could set it up in a different position. What's also really neat about RenderQ is I had all those cameras that I didn't want to use. If I don't want to have RenderQ render those cameras, I can just turn them off with the little eyeball. So I can turn them off here, or I can go in to RenderQ and turn them off there. So I'm going to have to remove this scene and then add the current one back. But see, I can hit the specific cameras and then I can select, like if I only want the first camera and the second camera to render, and I don't want any of the others, I just don't select them. I hit OK, then I hit render, and it's going to render the cameras I have selected, which is really cool. So there's a couple of ways to limit the cameras. This scene has way too many cameras. It's because the bathroom came with preset cameras. And so I just never deleted them when I was creating my scene for my tutorial. So I can turn them off here in the parameter scene tab, or I can turn them off in the render queue. So either way, I have my renders the way that I want them.